So my name is Sam Blau. I use she, her pronouns. I am the co-chair of the Baltimore Leadership Council, and I do work for BALT, which stands for Baltimore Action Legal Team. And we operate a bail fund, among other things, here in Baltimore. And one of our wonderful co-founders is, in fact, Jenny Egan. So I am very pleased to be able to introduce her to everyone here. So Jenny is the chief attorney for the Maryland Office of the Public Defender in Baltimore for their juvenile division, where for the past 3 years, she has led the office of 25 attorneys, core staff, social workers, and interns, which have successfully decreased Maryland's juvenile youth prison population by 66% and youth jail population by 50%. Before that, she spent 6 years as an assistant public defender in the juvenile division. She is, of course, one of our co-founders at Baltimore Action Legal Team. And she has served as a fellow with the Kaiser Permanente Baltimore Institute for Equitable Leadership and was a Margaret Fund Fellow with the National Women's Law Center. She was also the winner of the 2020 National Juvenile Defenders Robert E. Shepard Award for Excellence. So without further ado, I present Jenny Egan.
Hey guys, thanks so much, Sam. That was very kind of you. So I'll just get started. I wanted to start actually before I even share my screen with everyone by just saying whenever I'm in community with folks, I like to mention what's on my mind. And I just wanted to say that what I'm thinking about tonight is Rita Bowe Brown, who was a radical revolutionary and a Butch Dyke who was a part of the George Jackson Brigade, known as the Gentleman Bank Robber, who passed away at the age of 70 yesterday. And Bowe Brown is part of my political legacy and the working class anti-imperialist movement that I was schooled in as a young queer in rural working class Oregon. So I just wanted to shout out Bowe. And if anyone doesn't know about Bowe, there's a little Vimeo, like 20-minute documentary that's so rad and fun. And I linked it in the chat. So I just wanted to start by paying my tributes and saying rest in power to Bowe Brown, who was just an incredible anti-imperialist, anti-racist organizer and working class butch hero. All right, so now I will actually get started by sharing my screen. I'm gonna go over today and just talk a little bit about the court system. I'm gonna give the general outline, some of the basic facts, and then I'm happy to discuss and answer questions that get into those questions deeper and further. My little presentation is juries and judges and courts. Oh my. So this is me. I am on Twitter a lot, too much. I'm gonna try to take a break in the winter, but I don't know when, but you can find me there. That's one of my 2 kids. I live in Baltimore in District 2, and I love it here. I'm gonna talk about Maryland state courts. We're gonna talk about really local stuff. I'm not even gonna touch on federal courts or talk about federal court issues. I'm gonna keep it local, but I can go into that deeper. So in Maryland state courts, this is how I like to divide the road. There are trial courts and there are appellate courts. So the easiest way to think about it is that district court is what some people in old days or in different places have called small claims court, right? Magistrates, the sort of low level cases. So the things that are handled in district court, there's no juries, it's judge only, it's bench trials. They do civil and criminal work. They do domestic violence, landlord, tenant, but the civil cases have to have, less than 5,000 K at issue. The criminal penalties have to be misdemeanors or limited felonies. So it has to be a sentence of less than 3 years, and motor vehicle stuff, parking tickets, speeding tickets, those sorts of things. Those are district court. Circuit court is sort of, the big leagues. They have jury trials. They do major civil cases and criminal cases. So if the penalty is more than 3 years in prison, now just so you know, who thinks 1 year in prison is not serious, right? But whatever. And more serious DV cases. Circuit court is also where you hear all juvenile issues, family court, civil cases with big dollar decisions, and some appeals from district court. So those are the ones where you're going to actually have a trial, right? Where there's going to be some facts decided. And then we have 2 appellate courts in Maryland, the Court of Special Appeals. That's the intermediate appellate court. That's who would hear something. If you appealed from circuit court, you would first go to the Court of Special Appeals. Has 15 judges. They hear cases in panels of 3. And then above them is the Court of Appeals. There's only 7 judges on the Court of Appeals in Maryland. It's a pretty small highest court for the state, and they hear all the appeals from the appellate court, as well as they are the court of original jurisdiction for redistricting and issues if you're trying to remove a state official. So I just wanted to, that's sort of the division, and those are the 4 main courts you should know in Maryland. And now I'm going to go through, and each one of these will be a section of our talk tonight. But the cast of characters, the judges, right? So we're going to talk about the judiciary branch, who gets there, who is there. Then we're going to talk about the jury system. We're going to talk about prosecutors and the public defense system in Maryland, give you a brief outline of those. I'm happy to take questions in the chat as we go along, or do them all at the end, whatever you prefer. Judges. Judges are special because they are the only people in the courtroom allowed to wear very cheap flammable polyester robes, which is just a critical distinction for power. In Maryland, we do nonpartisan judicial elections. Nonpartisan is in scare quotes there because it's a little bit of a hybrid and a weird system. For a district court, those that low-level small claims court, district court, is not elected. Those are appointed by the governor, and they are appointed to 10-year terms. It's often the sort of, well, there's 2 trains of thought. There's some train of thought that it's the training ground for circuit court bench. You know, you get to be a judge, and then if you are a good judge, you would move up to circuit court. There's also a sort of, reputation that district court is where judges go to get appointed to jobs who can never get elected or can't make it to circuit court. So they have both reputations there. And circuit court, this is how we do it in Maryland. And this is what, it took me so long living in Baltimore to figure out how this works. But basically, there is a judicial selection committee in every county, and they nominate people. And the governor picks from those nominees, and they are appointed. Or you can run in an open election and challenge anyone's seat. But what you'll see often is the flyers that you get or the websites are the slate of sitting judges. The sitting judges are the ones that the governor has already appointed, because once they're appointed by the governor, within a year of being appointed, they have to go up for election. And that's why we have this hybrid system, right? Generally, most judges are getting appointed by the governor and then sitting for election when they already have the job. So they're already sitting from that point of power. Once they are appointed by the governor, they get welcomed into the sitting judges slate, like all the judges that have to run for re-election all team up together. And very few judges are elected without being appointed first. So that or elected, that's right there on my screen, that's very much in scare quotes. It does not happen often. In fact, in some counties, it has never happened at all. So generally what is happening, and most of our people on the bench were nominated by a judicial selection committee, appointed by the governor, and then ran and were confirmed by the public. So that's what I would call those elections. The appellate court is a similar system. The judicial selection committee nominates, the governor appoints, and then they have to sit for election within 1 year. If they are confirmed by the election, then they finish their 10-year terms. Now, what does our bench look like? I'm just going to talk about our appellate courts, the Court of Special Appeals and the Court of Appeals, because it's the easiest sort of smallest number to look at. There are currently 21 members of the appellate court, 14 out of 21, there's 1 vacancy that's open. 63% of them are men and 76% of them are white. And more than half, it's 52%. I actually think there's like 3 more prosecutors, but I was just moving quickly, so I only went with the ones I knew for sure, are former prosecutors. There are no Latinx folks on the bench in Maryland, no Asian folks, no former defenders, and only one person was born after 1970, and he is the newest judge. He was just appointed by Hogan as the new chief of the Court of Special Appeals last month. So you only have to be 30 to be on the appellate court, but the majority of our court was born before 1960. I have no bias against boomers or older folks, but I will just note that of 21 folks, 20 of them were not born in the latter half of this century. And I think that matters for not just decisions and perspective, but in terms of the pool of people we're drawing from, as a large majority of law schools were not graduating large numbers of women prior to 1980. And even after 1980, it didn't really start to improve until the 90s. So that is sort of what our bench looks like. It is overwhelmingly white. It is overwhelmingly white and male. And it is, there are only 7 women on the appellate bench. And that reflects a lot of what our local bench looks like too. Judges do a lot of things. As you guys know, they make decisions about guilt or innocence. But there are lots of things that I want to talk about the role of judges in the criminal legal system, as that's my expertise, that you don't think about, right? So if people don't come to court, they call it FTA. I'm also just going to do a lot of terms here, or failure to appear. Judges are deciding who has a valid reason that they couldn't get to court and who doesn't. They issue warrants that lead to people getting arrested. In Maryland, you can get a warrant for all sorts of things. Say you have a lot of outstanding parking tickets. A judge could order the sheriffs to go to your house, remove you from your bed at gunpoint, and take you and arrest you. Judges make those decisions all the time without a lawyer appearing for the person, right? So if it is your first case, or you don't know about the case, or you have never been served because you moved addresses and there's an outdated thing for you in the system, you have not applied for a public defender. No one's appearing for you in court. So when you don't show up because you don't know about it, no one is there to show up and say, hey, my client has work or couldn't be here or didn't get a phone call. Those warrants are going out. And so who judges are and what they know about the basics of poverty and life and what it means to be a working person and the practicalities that working people face is really critical for, especially for warrant and failure to appear decisions. They also make all kinds of decisions about searches, spying, and surveillance without defense counsel or without anyone present. So police officers apply for search warrants. They apply for requests to spy and to surveil people all the time. Those are proceedings that there is no opposition there. It is just law enforcement asking for permission to spy on residents and to violate their privacy. What is interesting is that all that happens without any defense counsel present. There's no evaluation of the officer. There's no information about that officer's reputation, their IAD files, that's their internal affairs files, nothing about if they've ever been found guilty of perjury, nothing. It is an assumption that an officer signing a sworn document is being honest. And that also creates a relationship. Like there is a private relationship between judges and police in that they have direct relations that don't happen with any other player in the system around searches, spying, and surveillance. And my judge could have signed 50 search warrants with an officer, right? And really gotten a lot of details about an investigation. And I could have that officer in another case on the stand that day, and I would have no idea that they had that relationship, or they had spent 5 evenings over the past month together working on warrants and surveilling people in the community. They also make lots of evidence and scientific determinations. So the one thing you probably all know about lawyers is they think that they're qualified to do almost any job, and they are rarely qualified to do anything. I say that as a lawyer. So what is scientific? What is generally accepted practice, what is provable, and what evidence comes in is all based on a judge, and a judge gets to make those determinations. And you will see from the state of our law that the legal profession is not so good at evaluating scientific evidence. I would say so myself. They are making the decisions about what police misconduct should be public and what should not be public. That is a judicial determination. And so judges in Maryland decide, a circuit court judge decides whether a child should go to juvenile or adult prison. In Maryland, we charge more children per capita in adult court than any other place except for Alabama. And Alabama's data is 5 years old and hasn't been updated, and they changed their laws about 3 years ago. So I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure Maryland sends the most. Our judges have been making those decisions for not that long, just about a generation, since 1994. And that is a decision that judges get to make. They also get to make decisions around sentencing and how sentencing is going to work and what enhancements have been proven and what have not. So there's lots of things that judges are doing in the criminal legal system that are different than ruling on objections or finding people guilty or innocent. Oh, come on, slide. Oh, so I went too fast. So that's sort of the role of judges. I'm just doing big picture, and then we can drill down and answer questions and specific questions that people have had. Juries, that's how this little, what do you call those? Vector drawing is how I like to imagine the jury perceives me. I'm just like singing karaoke and they're eating it up. In fact, what really happens is that I sweat through not just my undershirt, my button down, and my suit, and then I just drip sweat onto the floor every time in front of the jury. So if you ever
Jenny, there's a quick yes or no question in the chat of the educational background of judges and whether they have to be lawyers first.
Yeah, so they do have to be lawyers, and they do have to be 30 years old. They have to be barred in Maryland, and they just have to be 30, barred in Maryland, and have a good reputation. There are like the judicial nominating committees for each county have criteria that are all set by regulation. So it's not statute, it's regulation. And then there are a bunch of like affinity bar associations. So I know that I have done for the LGBTQ Bar Association, what they do is they like interview judicial candidates and then sort of give them a thumbs up or a thumbs down to the greater judicial nominating committee. So it's sort of the criteria is just like basic fitness. They look at your history of complaints, whether or not there are attorney grievances, but generally it is just you're a lawyer in good standing over the age of 30. And then why do we have the elections for judges? I have a great, how does one get on the committee for recommending judges? Mr. Sugarman, I don't know. It is an appointed process. So you sort of run and then they vote who should be on the committee. Why do we have the elections? The reason for this sort of nonpartisan election, or the argument, is that there are really strong arguments for electing judges, accountability to voters, all those sorts of things. And then there's really good reasons for not having election for judges, which is that you don't want their decisions to be swayed by politics. You don't want them to have to campaign, to take money, to be beholden to people. All of those reasons are why you wouldn't want judges. And so Maryland has come up with this sort of hybrid system where we nominate, where there's sort of an approval process, and then the voters get the ultimate say and can kick people out if there's some big controversy. It's debatable how well that works. So that is the educational background. For juries, so juries are the faulty foundation of American democracy. Juries are mentioned in the Constitution. Everyone loves juries. Juries are what what the founders thought what made us different, that it would be a jury of your peers. Of course, the founders only thought of their peers as landed white male landowners. And so ever since the democratic mantle has been expanded to more and more populations, you have seen the juries and the reliance on juries become less and less, right? They've been more and more circumscribed as we return more and more power to white landed landowners. So in Maryland, the jury pool, who gets selected for the jury, comes from two places: voter registration and MVA records. If you can imagine who is most excluded from voter registration and MVA records, it is poor people. It is people of color. Black people especially show up in voter registration and MVA records less. And once you are on jury duty, once you appear and are picked for a jury, you only get, I believe it's $14 a day, but it might have been moved up to $16 this year. You get $14 a day for lunch. You don't get your wages if you are an hourly worker. They have to give you leave to attend jury service, but they don't have to pay you while you're out, which means that there are many, many qualified jurors who are not registered to vote, who are never allowed to serve on juries as a result. There are many, many qualified jurors who do not drive or do not have a driver's license, and so they are never called to serve. And working folks simply cannot afford jury duty. Neither can primary caretakers of children. There's no child care offered, right? So if you are a waged worker, working for minimum wage at 30 hours a week so that you never have to they don't have to pay you benefits, doing jury duty is simply too much of a burden for most working people. I would say for most working people, jury duty is just too much of an inconvenience, and so people avoid it like the plague. It is inherently rigged for the wealthy and for white folks and for those who can afford salaried workers or those who don't have to work for their survival. And that is critical because the majority of people who will face those juries don't look like that. The majority of people who face juries in Maryland, in fact, 80% or more, are indigent. And we'll go through what that means. But the majority of people are not just poor, but extremely poor. And so what we have is a system of juries of middle class and wealthy people who are usually majority white, passing judgment on majority people of color in Maryland who are poor. And that is how our justice system is set up. So I know this is one thing that's very unique to juries in Maryland. If you've ever sat on a jury in Maryland, it's different than court shows. So voir dire is that term that we use when lawyers or judges. Yeah, go ahead. Did somebody want to ask a question? All right, great. Yeah, so, oh, the going rate is $15. Thanks, Jen. I knew it moved up $1 or $2, but I didn't know how much. Voir dire is when lawyers ask jurors question, and when you watch TV and when you watch How to Make a Murderer and Law and Order, it's always the attorney that goes up and says, you know, have you ever been robbed? And do you think you can make partial decision, you know, an impartial decision, even though you're, you know, still scarred from this thing that happened to you 30 years ago? That is what happens in most places. Maryland is unique in that it has court-directed voir dire. The statute allows for attorney-directed voir dire, but in Baltimore, it is just not the practice, which means that rather than sitting a jury and the lawyers asking questions and developing rapport, we do this weird thing where everyone sits in the room and the judge asks a question. And if your answer is yes, you stay standing up, and then the clerk marks down your jury number. So in Baltimore, if you go to jury duty, you'll all, like 100 people will sit in a room and they'll say, does anyone, this is a real question happened in my trial, is anyone unable to make a decision without racial bias, right? Like if you cannot make a decision without engaging racial bias, please stay standing. Now I've been in 100 trials, everyone sits down immediately, but I was in one where one man just stayed standing up. Then once all the questions have been asked, then one at a time, the jurors come up and the defense attorney, the prosecutor, and the judge ask them about their responses. So they go through the questions. They're like, question 1, you said you know someone in the trial. Who is it? And they're going to be like, oh, I know the clerk. Okay, fine. We're going to keep moving. Oh, number 2, you said that you were racially biased. I had a juror say, yes, I am a white supremacist. And they quickly got struck. And what struck means is that that juror gets to leave and is not considered and doesn't get to be one of the 12 jurors or the alternates. Striking for cause is when the court strikes a juror because they can't serve fairly. So that's when the court decides, listen, she has a daycare issue and absolutely is not going to be able to pay attention because she's going to be so distraught when she's here, or that man says that he hates Black people, they can't serve fairly. That's called striking for cause. The other kinds of strikes are called preemptory challenges. In a small level case or a normal case, the prosecution and if the maximum sentence is between 0 and 20 years, every defense and prosecution can each strike 4 jurors just because they want to. In cases where it's 20 to life, the state's attorney can strike 5 jurors per defendant. So if there's 2 defendants in the same trial, they'd get 10. And each defendant gets 10 strikes. And in a life case, the defense gets 20 and the state's attorney gets 10. I did a murder trial once with 3 defendants, which meant that the 3 defendants each got 20. So the defense had 60 and the state had 30. So we each got to strike 60 people. You can imagine how big, plus there's all the strikes for cause. We need a pool of like 200 folks to winnow it down. The question is, what are we striking for, right? As a defendant, I know what I'm striking for. I'm striking for people who look like they're not gonna like my client, like they're glaring at him, like they're uncomfortable, like those who have bias. The prosecutor is doing the same thing. But what we know is there was a case called Batson. It's one of a Supreme Court's case that said that prosecutors cannot strike jurors based on their race, right? You can't strike someone because they're Black, right? And that is wonderful. It's a very important case, except for very few people have won a Batson challenge since the case, since the Supreme Court ruled on it in 1986. You cannot use a peremptory challenge to discriminate for any reason, right? Race, sex, religion, any of those things, because it violates the Constitution. The problem is, how do you prove it? And even when prosecutors strike all the Black people on the jury or strike all the women on a jury, it's very hard to prove that they're doing it, because they can just say, no, I decided to strike everyone who was wearing a red dress that day, Your Honor, or I decided to strike every odd number. The few challenges that have been proven are literally just when the prosecutor was sloppy and wrote B next to the name of all the Black people that they were striking on the jury. It is I think that preemptory challenges for the state should be banned. I think that is probably the only way to winnow out that the discriminatory process of jury selection. And I think you would be shocked how much prosecutors are trained to discriminate and to cover up their discrimination. So that would be my argument for eliminating the state's ability for peremptory challenges and forcing. I also think the court should be forced to allow attorney-directed voir dire. Those are just my little opinions that I can talk about for ages if you want to. And then I said that this for this audience, this is what drives me nuts when I'm selecting juries and the best person in the room who knows most about the system decides that they want to volunteer way more information than's asked in voir dire, right? So the voir dire is like, can you serve fairly? And my juror gets up to the table and they're like, I can serve fairly, Your Honor, but I do know that the Baltimore police are under consent decree. And they sort of show off for everybody that they know how unfair the system is. You're not helping me, and you're not helping people being punished by the system. Right? So here's what I will say. Answer the question that's asked and don't go above and beyond on the topic. I also think this was really a problem in death penalty cases, as Maryland doesn't have the death penalty any longer, at least we don't for now. And we used to have this in death penalty cases that courts would strike for cause anyone who didn't support the death penalty, even when it was the majority of people, right? Because people would say that they couldn't vote for that given their own objections to the law. I would say just answer the questions that are asked, and also be open, right? Like, can you make a fair decision? If you can make a fair decision, and whatever that means to you, I think that you should try very hard to stay on juries. And if you are ever on a jury, please Google jury nullification, Google jury nullification, Google jury nullification. And I can talk about jury nullification if you want. But first, I'm just trying to get through all of it, not go too long. And then I'm going to talk about defenders and then prosecutors. So in Maryland, there is a statewide public defender system. This is, I believe, the best way to do it. In many other places, the public defense system, as you may know, Gideon v. Wainwright, it was the Supreme Court decision in 1966 that said that all criminal defendants needed and deserved a lawyer. What I will tell you that is depressing is that defendants are more likely to be arrested and more likely to be imprisoned post-Gideon than they are pre-Gideon. And so while defense attorneys and the right to a defense lawyer is a critical constitutional right, I do not think that that right has ever been fully implemented in the United States, and remains to this day a Band-Aid on a gaping wound meant to legitimize a system of mass incarceration for people of color. I do not think that we have a robust and fair defense system in the United States. And I say that as someone who spends every hour of her day as a defender, knowing that I am helping to legitimize what is the extension of slavery and Jim Crow. And yet, here we are. We hope and we fight for a better future, even if it doesn't happen in our time. So who qualifies for a public defender, and how many people are represented by public defenders in Maryland? Well, in Maryland, you qualify for a public defender if you make less than the federal poverty level, right? So say you are an individual and you have a job and you make only $11,000 a year. You qualify for a defender, right? Not if you inherited your mother's home, right? In Maryland, as of, I think it was about 15 years ago, we're supposed to means test not just income, but all assets. And so we get people who are not qualified, even though that they make under the federal poverty guidelines. And also look at those federal poverty guidelines. If you make $30,000 and you have a family of 4, which means that you can barely, you can't pay rent, you can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment in the city and buy groceries, and you also then would not qualify for a public defender. That being said, there's some wiggle room around there, and our commissioners are very generous. There are some factors that everyone is allowed to consider, and that means that we actually do qualify a lot of people. In fact, about 80% of defendants in Maryland are represented at trial by a public defender. It's about 95% of people at bail review hearings. So initially, the Office of the Public Defender represents almost every defendant who is facing having their liberty revoked. But the majority of people in prison and facing charges in Maryland are not just poor, but very poor. This is sort of my quick breakdown of budgets. I can show you my sources if you want, but prosecutors across Maryland have budgets of $171.8 million compared to the entire Maryland Office of the Public Defender has $110 million budget. But I just say this because then you have to look at the police budget, right? Prosecutors don't have to hire witnesses because the police, like about drug distribution, because the police are their witnesses. They don't have to hire scientists. They don't have to hire firearms examiners. All of those come out of the policing budget. But when you look at the Maryland Office of Public Defender budget, that is our budget for the attorneys, for the experts, for the firearm examiner, for the private investigator, for the process server. That's everything. So when you compare the prosecution and the policing budget to the defense budget, That's where you get the huge disparity. That's right. We spend $3 billion for prosecution and policing in Maryland compared to $110 million for defense. In other words, for every dollar spent on policing and prosecution, we spend just 3 cents on defending people from the entire weight of the apparatus of the state bearing down against them and threatening their liberty. 3 cents for every dollar we spend policing and prosecuting. That doesn't include the additional $2 billion that we spend then incarcerating those people, because that would shrink what we spend defending them even less. And the majority of people, once they are in prison, do not qualify for public defenders and do not have representation once they are sent to prison. So I'll throw it out there. I'm supposed to talk about prosecutors and their role in the system. Prosecutors are elected.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly, Jenny, because we're at your official time, but we have plenty of time for questions, but just to let you know in terms of what you want to say at what pace.
Great. There's only 2 more minutes, so I'm going to be 2 minutes over, and then we can open up to questions and discussion. So there are 24 county prosecutors plus the city, 23 plus the city, that are elected every 4 years around the state. Most recently, one of the longest serving prosecutors in the state, Mr. Castley, was just disbarred by the Court of Appeals last week for lying multiple times and withholding evidence that led to a man serving 33 years in prison. He had served in the prosecutor's office since the 1980s and had retired only once the action was posted against him. So prosecutors are extremely powerful. They stay in office for a long time. The statewide prosecutor is the Attorney General. That is Brian Frosch right now, but he's retiring. So we're going to have an election in 2022 to elect a new prosecutor. I always say prosecutors aren't progressive. You can't be progressive. I don't think anyone who is progressive puts people in prison. I follow the Project NIA abolitionist principles for prosecutor organizing. And so I just wanted to lay those principles out. I can talk about them more in detail, but always understand that prosecutors are law enforcement. They send people to prison, jail, parole, and probation. Prosecution is a systemic and structural component of the criminal punishment system. Abolition is opposed to prosecution. I, as an abolitionist, am not, I don't think we need better prosecutors, right? I think we need to have no prosecution. They're not social workers, they're not therapists, housing advocates, they don't provide services, and they aren't experts in them. Prosecuting offices cannot be co-governed with or by community organizations, and prosecutors, this is very important to me, must be stripped of power and resources. Even as they restructure their offices, even as they put conviction integrity review units in place, prosecutors do not need and should not get additional resources. That work should be redistributed to people who are doing the work to free folks, not those who have a conflict of interest and have a history of aggressive prosecution and have got us to the place where we are. And where we are in Maryland, just so you know, is that 70% of prisoners in Maryland are Black. That's the highest percentage in the nation, double the national average of 35%, 20% higher than our closest competitor, which is Mississippi. So although I don't believe that prosecutors can be progressive, I do think progressives can push and organize around prosecutorial elections. I would encourage everyone here to ask and push any candidates whether or not they will agree to stop charging children in adult court. It is an international, it is one of the reasons we are not a signatory to the Treaty on Children, is because we continue to send children to adult prison, unlike most nations around the world. Whether or not they will end the use of all sentencing enhancements, whether or not they will ban all deception and interrogation, which leads to innocent people being imprisoned, whether or not they will agree to end asking for all cash bail, and whether or not they will commit to reducing their jail and prison population by 50% in 5 years. And if they can't explain why they won't, They are not only not progressive, you should organize against them. I'm happy to talk about some weird terms in the court system, but I'm just going to open it up to questions and see what I missed in the chat.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenny.
That
was a lot in a little bit of time. And I don't know about anyone else, but I really appreciated the visuals and felt like I was able to follow along as a novice to the system. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it to my co-chair of this team, Jen, to open us up with our first question or two. And as we discuss those, please do keep putting some questions in the chat, folks, and I will aggregate as needed. Go for it, Jen.
Thanks so much, Laura. And thank you so much, Jenny. So much stuff in that presentation. We heard a little bit about what folks that might be serving on a jury at some point should know. And we heard a little bit about what we should potentially be asking candidates. I guess, are there other things that you think folks like us could do to hold the system accountable when it doesn't align with our values of racial justice and equity?
So one thing about lawyers in general in the legal profession is that it's really insular and very filled with people who have power. The number one indicator whether or not you're going to score well on the LSAT is whether or not your parents are lawyers and whether or not they have an income over $150,000 a year. It doesn't correlate to intelligence or even whatever. So I would say jury nullification is an important principle to understand. That's the principle that you could vote for a not guilty verdict if you think that the outcome would be unfair. Another thing is to just push for some of those really big reforms. For example, our court system has separated out juries are when they find guilt and innocence are not allowed to know what the penalty is, right? So when you go to jury duty and you have to decide if somebody is guilty or innocent on first-degree assault, you are not supposed to know that somebody could go to prison for life, right? You're not supposed to know what the penalty is, and it might change your feeling. So that's my first, is know how atrocious these penalties are, and know and be in community with people who are facing prosecution. I think that it's everyone's obligation to be in community with people who are incarcerated. Maureen Caraba, who's one of my favorite abolitionists, says that you cannot have accountability without being in community. And the majority of people in the criminal legal system and on juries are not in community with the people that they are imprisoning. So the first thing I would say is learn about the prison conditions where you live, organize and fight against them, and be in community with people. Become a pen pal, reach out to people, teach a class inside. I think you have to be in community with imprisoned people to change the mindset and the social conditioning we have to ostracize criminal defendants from our communities. And then other thing, I don't know, Jen, what else? I'm just drawing a blank, but I know there's lots of other things.
That was great. I'm gonna
Don't get out of jury duty. Serve your jury duty. Yeah.
I definitely went in September. They didn't call me. But Laura, I think you've got a whole list now, potentially, of questions that we want to ask.
Yeah, we've got a short list to start with. I want to go back to just a little nitty-gritty question about the demographics of judges. One person asked if there are any LGBTQIA+ members on the court.
None that I am aware of. So, but I don't know them all personally, and I looked at all of their judge bios. None of them identify that way. But I don't know, because I dig deeper, I don't know everybody on the appellate bench, but nobody identifies that way on their judicial biographies.
Yeah. And
they would, they would.
Yeah.
Maybe.
There are a couple of There are a couple of questions about folks going through the court system, if I was interpreting this correctly, or maybe it was about supporting folks going through the court system. So one was someone asked, are there mental health workers or psychiatrists available through any of this?
No.
And if that was your question and I'm interpreting it, who you were directing it at incorrectly, please let me know in the chat or speak up.
Great. So there are probably 3 or 4 social workers in the entire prison system in Maryland. We have tens of thousands of prisoners, and they are triaging the most basic things. No, there is not treatment in Maryland prisons. There is not very much treatment or counseling in Maryland's youth prisons, let alone their actual prisons. They are human rights violations across the board. They are horrible, abusive places. And there are, not that there aren't good actors, right? Like there are lots of, Goucher does a great college education program. There's lots of people who work in prisons who love and care about the people behind bars. They simply do not give resources to quality services. And in fact, a majority of people imprisoned in Maryland have a diagnosable mental health condition, and the majority of mental health medications are barred inside. So people with the most severe psychiatric disorders are not allowed to have or access even basic medical care. Like if you need lithium to not hear voices, you are not getting it.
Sure.
Hear the voices. That's it.
Wait. Thank you for sharing that. So there's a question here from Ellie, and please, Ellie, also jump in on the chat, or if you're comfortable unmuting, who asked, how can minors do their part be taken seriously, or people under 30? Ellie, is that in reference to activists outside the prison system?
Well, it's kind of just anything in general, because I know when I talk to people about my thoughts, a lot of times it's seen as like, she's a kid, she eats butterflies and rainbows, and isn't taken seriously. And things that I think would be basic human rights are seen as radical sometimes. And I'm just wondering, how do I communicate how I'm feeling without being seen as, like, how do I not exactly sugarcoat how I'm feeling, but also show it in a way that they don't feel attacked by what I'm saying, but also get the point across, and just do anything I'm able to for it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ellie.
That's a great question. So Ellie, first of all, I would say that systems of power and oppression like to dismiss people who have radical kindness and empathy as daydreamers, as a way to rob you of your power, right? So I will just say that I may not anymore, but I do look a little young, and for years people just treated me that way. I'd be in a room, a full ass lawyer, and people would be like, that crazy abolitionist girl, she's just a dreamer. First of all, I'm not a dreamer. I'm very, very, very angry and depressed about the system. But 2, just know more than they do. That's how I got through it, right? Like I know the facts better than they know them. I know the numbers better than they know them, and they'll be surprised, right? So once you know the facts better than they know them, you can talk them through them and walk them through your ideas and thoughts. And then the other one is, the other thing that I really have found great about the last like sort of 4 or 5 years around dialogues around abolition and incarceration is the best answer is what we have, what we've been doing doesn't work, right? We know it doesn't work. So rather than just poo-poo my ideas or say that won't work, try to justify to me why doing the same thing that we've been doing for a generation that's making things worse, why isn't it better to at least try something new? That's but I don't know, Laura and Jen, you might have better ideas and discussions about rhetorical techniques.
Well, I'll just jump in here and say there's a whole community of people who have been working on this question of how do we communicate our messages, especially at a young age. I personally do a lot of youth advocacy training, and Ellie, if that is something you're interested in learning more about or participating in or finding out where it's happening in the city, please let us know, because when youth get together to make their message loud, then it can sometimes be even more powerful than a bunch of adults sitting around, because youth have the power of inspiration. So please let us know and be in touch. I have some questions here about abolition work, and I also just want to do a time check from Rachel. We still have a few more minutes, yeah?
Yeah, we have about 8 minutes.
Okay, great. So somebody asked, what is a good place to start to learn about abolition work? And also someone asked, on a related note, but much bigger question, how do you maintain hope? And so maybe you could answer that personal question a little bit.
Yeah, so first I was just putting 2 things in the chat. Good places to start. I always start with Project NIA. Project NIA is a project that comes out of Chicago, but was originally founded by Miriam Karaba. And they do youth organizing around abolition, and they started out working on ending youth incarceration and expanded to all incarceration. That was my entree point into abolition, but I also would point out Derica Pernell's Becoming Abolitionist. Derica is a resident of Baltimore and an amazing radical abolitionist lawyer who has probably, the best book this 6 months on abolition is just incredible. I would also point to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's just probably the most established scholar on abolition. Good reading, fun videos, but Project NIA makes it really easy as an access point and an entry point. How do I maintain hope? I don't. No, just kidding. So it's always it's a process, and it's not also not a journey. It's like it's like a walking path where I keep coming back to different benches and hanging out for periods of time. Right now, I am holding on to hope I hang out to hope by not participating or spending all my time with defenders. I have an organizing practice. I have organizing work. I have people who are organizing and fighting on the ground and in the street, and I keep myself anchored to that because that is where I get energy and where I can feel love and where I can feel surrounded and cared for. I draw a lot of hope from young people. I work with young people. I work with teenagers, and I don't know. When you've sat next to a young person and they've been sentenced to prison, I've sat next to a 16-year-old sentenced to prison for 30 years and just been ready to give up on all things, right? Just walk out of my life in every way. And when that child turns to you and says thank you, it felt good to have somebody fight for you, I stay in sometimes for other people. And I stay in the work, which I think is evil, and a system that I think is evil, because I do want at some point to have just stood next to someone and stood witness. I believe that everyone deserves a witness, and everyone who is being oppressed and treated poorly deserves a witness. And I believe that I am staying in the work, not because I think that I'm making some big difference or change, but literally just stand as witness to people, to say, I see your humanity. I see that you have value and I care about you. And I stood up even as I watched the tide come, right? Even as the flood came. And then I think it's my obligation. I am obligated to fight for a better world, even if I will not experience it in my time. I hope for it for somebody else someday. So that's how I maintain hope. I'm fighting for a better world, and I hope that somebody gets to reap that harvest someday.
Oh, that is so incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. We have one more question here, which I think could be a nice question to end on. And then I see Elia hand raised as well. So if we have time, I want to come back to you, which says, curious about the campaign to elect a progressive slate of judges in New Orleans. And if that's an example to look to. We know you said that we don't have progressive prosecutors, but can we have progressive judges?
No, probably not, but I like how they did it. Yeah. So a bunch of former public defender, I mean, New Orleans is this crazy place, right? So New Orleans was funding its defense system. This is why I said the state agency of the defender has lots of problems. Like, it's weird to be a government employee and then fight against the government. It's very strange. But New Orleans did it really bad. They funded their defender system for years with the fines and fees collected from defendants. That's right. The defender's office only had enough money to defend people if there were enough people being fined. And yeah, so after Katrina, all this stuff happened, they reorganized, blah, blah, blah. And a bunch of defenders have organized and ran for a slate. I think I'm remembering correctly, to get on the bench. I do think it's an incredible model. I do think organizing around judicial elections, like, it is one place where there could be real power, right? Because right now we just accept the sitting judges, they all get nominated, and they all come from a certain milieu. They are all politically connected, and the majority of them are prosecutors. I would say when we were talking about bias, I was like, the biggest bias I see in the judicial system is that all our judges are former prosecutors. And if they're deciding whether or not to release police misconduct records that go back 20 years, that's when they were prosecutors with these police. And if the record comes out and shows that the prosecutor at the time didn't turn over the record, which would have been an illegal constitutional violation, guess who the person is making the decision? The person who used that cop in hundreds of trials throughout the 1990s is now sitting on the bench deciding that no one can see that record because it might implicate them. It is a very incestuous system. I think that is one organizing place that could be very important, is that most of these judges are not worried about an electoral challenge. If progressives and like people united for just, like, we really got a candidate and pushed the bench and showed that the people could elect someone to the bench, I think it would be an incredible thing. The problem is you're going to be hard pressed to find somebody who wants to be not going to find an abolitionist who wants to be a judge, right? Like, you have to find somebody who is familiar enough with the system that they feel comfortable sending people into prison. It's hard. It's hard once you've seen that system and it injures your soul and you believe it's a human rights violation. It's hard to then ask to be in charge of it. I don't know, man. I don't know.
Well, thank you so much for sharing everything you shared with us this evening. I'm gonna give a chance to our community organizer, Rachel, to let us know some JUFJ campaigns that are connected to these issues of the court systems, because in addition to elections and all the other advocacy Jenny mentioned, there are things happening that are getting at the system from all sides, and ways to bring back some positivity and hope through the political action that we are doing, in addition to the work of bearing witness to things that might be sad or despairing, or just the witnessing of oppression. So with that, I will turn it to you, Rachel.
Oh, I did want to say something about staying positive.
Oh yeah, please, Allie, go ahead.
So I went through a really hard time in my life, and therapy is like something I cannot stress enough, and not feeling like ashamed to go to therapy. If you have the time, I really do recommend it, especially around staying positive, is DBT. It's group therapy. It's about dialectical based thinking. And it really teaches you how to communicate with others and skills to stay positive while still doing the nitty-gritty work. And just don't feel ashamed about therapy, and group therapy can be a great way to talk with other people and just get the materials that you maybe weren't taught in school, that aren't talked about enough in society, and get those tools to help you through what you want to do that might be really hard.
I'd just like to say thank you to Ellie for reminding me that that is actually the only way that I maintain hope, is that I go to therapy weekly. So, seconded.
Ellie, thank you so much for that reminder. And also just a really important reminder about the importance of a mental health care system and a public healthcare system that actually meets the needs of our community. So I really appreciate that reminder. Just with our remaining few minutes, I'm just going to make a couple connections to what Jenny shared in the presentation. I'm like blown away, and I think I'm still processing so much of this. I'm so grateful for your time, energy, putting this presentation together for us, Jenny. It's mind-boggling. I think that's all I can come up with. And I'm someone who used to work in the Eastside District Courthouse. You know, I saw this stuff, and it's still like a wild reminder of the failures of our justice system. So I'm just going to make a couple quick connections to our campaigns and then pass it off to Jen to close us out. Next slide, please, Jen. Oh, I'm going to stop recording now, actually.